All right, welcome to the Alberta Provincial Housing and Service Needs Estimation wrap-up event. My name is Lisa Belanger. I'm the incoming interim CEO for the Rural Development Network, or the RDN. I got a cold yesterday, so apologies if my voice fails me today, but want to welcome you all. We have many people joining us, ranging from project coordinators and service providers, municipal representatives from participating communities. We have funders, representatives from the provincial and federal governments, as well as communities and service providers from outside of Alberta who are interested in learning more about the project and the data collected. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that RDN's physical office is located in Amiskwaciwâskagen, known as Beaver Hills House or Edmonton. We're located in the traditional territories of Treaty 6 and home to the Métis and Inuit peoples. I thank our hosts, the Nahiawak Cree, the Saulteaux, Niitsitapi Blackfoot, Red River Métis, and Aheahe Nakota, whose traditional lands we stand upon today. As we organize around pressing issues like homelessness, anti-racism, gender equity, and decolonization, we recognize and hold ourselves accountable for the past and present harms perpetuated against Indigenous communities. I recognize that our very presence on this land, for those of us who are not Indigenous, is a reflection of the systemic colonization that has resulted in dispossession, discrimination, and violence against Indigenous peoples. I want to take this opportunity to reaffirm my personal responsibility and RDN's organizational responsibility and commitment to reconciliation. And I also think it's important to remind folks that this land acknowledgement is simply that, an acknowledgement as we continue working and learning more about how we can prioritize upholding conditions of the treaties that govern this land. RDN recognizes the significance of September 30th as the Day for Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day, just a few days from now. And as an organization, we're taking this opportunity to encourage staff to engage in learning about Indigenous history and the ongoing wrongdoings that persist, and to celebrate the diverse and resilient Indigenous cultures that enrich our society. The purpose of the event today is twofold. First is to celebrate the hard work of the participating communities in ensuring the success of this project. And the second is to highlight the provincial findings from the estimation and opportunities for addressing housing insecurity in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities moving forward. I'll just start off with a bit about who we are. The Rural Development Network is a nonprofit that works across Canada. We focus on rural sustainability and creating tangible community impact. We understand that rural communities have unique needs and challenges and opportunities, and many programs out there are created and delivered in urban centers, but they often don't serve or can't be delivered in the same way in rural areas because of the different realities there, both social and economic. So the main things that we do overall are we create innovative tools and resources, including guides and toolkits that are created in partnership with rural communities and organizations and are designed specifically for rural areas. We provide expertise and boost capacity in implementing projects. We do advocacy work and help to connect people in the sector through events and networks, and we support groups in accessing funding. I want to also provide just a bit of context on the history of the housing and service needs estimations. So as many of you know, the national standard for measuring homelessness is the point-in-time count, in which a lead organization gathers volunteers to walk around the community for a 24-hour period, asking anyone they encounter on the street to fill out a survey. And it can be a very effective method for measuring homelessness, and the data collected through those point-in-time counts is incredibly valuable. However, in 2016, we started hearing from rural communities and partners that they were struggling to make the point-in-time count methodology work for them, because rural, remote, and Indigenous communities are often more geographically spread out, have fewer resources, and most importantly, they see different kinds of homelessness than in the urban centers. Rural homelessness can be more hidden. People may be couch surfing or experiencing housing insecurity, for example, as opposed to being unsheltered. And in addition, many of these communities don't have an emergency shelter in their area. So with all this in mind, RDN set out to adapt the point-in-time count methodology to better suit the needs of rural communities. So we engage with communities, people experiencing homelessness, and academics from across the country, and developed the step-by-step guide to estimating rural homelessness in 2017. And that was a project funded by the Government of Canada's homelessness partnering strategy. Then we piloted this methodology in Rocky Mountain House here in Alberta. And the community did a point in time count while simultaneously conducting an estimation using the methodology from the guide. And the results were really remarkable. The point in time count identified 2 people as experiencing or at risk of homelessness, whereas the rural methodology had identified 44 people. So this solidified the need to continue this work and to gather more accurate data for rural areas. But it became apparent that rural, remote, and Indigenous communities still struggle to access funding, support, and training to conduct those estimations. And so RDN, with funding from Reaching Home, facilitated a housing and service needs estimation in Alberta with 20 communities in partnership with the FCSSAA. And this was followed by a second iteration in 2020 to update the data with 24 communities this time. And then in January of 2023, we launched the third iteration of the estimation, again, with partial funding from Reaching Home. And this is what we're here today to share. Since its launch in 2017, more than 50 communities have successfully used the step-by-step guide to estimating rural homelessness to better understand what homelessness looks like in their area. And the key thing is that it doesn't end with the data. The data is the starting point for communities to advocate for support and funding and resources to actually address those needs. So, for example, after reading a homelessness estimation report in 2018, Synovus, who is an oil and gas company working in the area, created a 5-year, $50 million housing program to support the community of Conclin, Alberta, in addressing homelessness in the area. Drayton Valley was also able to use their data collected in 2020 to secure funding for emergency shelter pods. Whitecourt and the Soaring Eagle Support Society used the data to advocate for the closed down motel to be turned into an emergency and transitional shelter. And Peace River opened its very first emergency shelter based on the needs identified through that estimation. And I could go on. And the reality is that meaningful and relevant data on rural, remote, and Indigenous homelessness is hard to come by, but can have an instrumental effect on communities when collected properly and shared widely. So I really look forward to the opportunity to continue this work, both in Alberta and across Canada. And I want to introduce Laurel, who's the chair of the Alberta Regional Advisory Board for Reaching Home.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Oh, good morning. All right, I think I'm unmuted. All right, my name is Laurel Fitzsimons, as you heard, and I've been a member of the Alberta Reaching Home Regional Advisory Board for a number of years and have served as the board's chair for the last 2 years. I was previously the director of FCSS at Leduc County, and I've always had a strong passion for bringing awareness of this issue, being rural and remote homelessness, and developing responses to support this vulnerable community. The Regional Advisory Board for Reaching Home, which is the federal government's homelessness strategy aimed at reducing and preventing homelessness across Canada. We are tasked with the difficult decisions of distributing Reaching Home funding to rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in Alberta. During multiple calls for proposals over the last few years, we have been consistently oversubscribed as we receive funding requests from rural communities across the province that far exceed the funding that we've received. Although we're very grateful for that funding, of course. The difference, though, is often millions of dollars. Actually, it's always millions of dollars, I think, in between what we have to work with and what we probably need. Approximately 35% of Alberta's population live outside of the 7 major cities. While this past year, the provincial government announced winter shelter response funding for a few select rural communities, there is no annual provincial funding that is earmarked for rural communities to respond to homelessness. Overall, there is a significant gap in provincial and federal funding that is invested in the 7 cities versus the rural communities. As rural homelessness is recognized to be on the rise, we often receive applications from organizations who are interested in better understanding the issue of rural, remote, and Indigenous homelessness in their own communities, in terms of what it looks like and specifically their numbers. During my time working for Leduc County, we were the first organization in Alberta to work with the RDN, who was previously known as Alberta Rural Development Network, to estimate the number of people experiencing or at risk of homelessness in the county. In 2022, the board approved the Rural Development Network's Alberta Provincial 2023 Housing and Service Needs Estimation Project, which you'll be learning more about today. I'm here today to support the work of the Rural Development Network, as our board recognizes the importance of gathering this data and using it in future as a launching pad. So we would like to organize the data and in order to better respond to the needs in our community. I would like to introduce you now to Emma Wallace, who will share more about the 2023 Alberta Provincial Housing and Service Needs Estimation Project. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel, and thanks, Lisa, for introducing us and welcoming us to the event. So, hi, everyone. Thrilled to see you all here today. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on the screen. For those of you who maybe we haven't met yet, my name is Emma Wallace, and I have been managing the 2023 Alberta Provincial Housing and Service Needs Estimation Project since it began last year. So I'm just going to get ready to share my screen, and I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so just walking you through the project, what it is, a little bit more about why we did it, and then really highlighting those results from the project and maybe some kind of opportunities or recommendations that are coming out of this project. As I share my screen, Cash, if you just give me a thumbs up that we can see the screen. Perfecto, thank you so much. If you have questions throughout the conversation, feel free to pop them in the chat or just hold on to them. We've kind of set aside essentially the first hour to really do the kind of information sharing portion. And then we've got half hour or so at the end to have a discussion and or answer any questions. So hold on to them as we go. So the first thing I want to do before I really dive into the project itself is I want to get us all in on a common ground in terms of, you know, what I mean when I say homelessness or housing insecurity. I want to make sure that we're just all on the same page. The definitions you see on your screen were created by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and they are the nationally recognized definitions of homelessness. And they really highlight the different circumstances that can be experienced by someone who is homeless. So for example, someone who is sleeping in their car might be considered unsheltered, while someone staying in a women's shelter is considered emergency sheltered. Similarly, if someone is couch surfing, sleeping in an abandoned building, or in an overcrowded or damaged housing situation, they'd be considered provisionally accommodated. And then lastly, there are those folks who are at risk of homelessness. And these are people who, their housing situation is precarious. For the purposes of this project and today's presentation, we use the umbrella term housing insecure to define everyone on the spectrum. And we do that mostly because when we chatted with communities, people had a bit of an easier time wrapping their head around the term housing secure to identify the entire spectrum of homelessness. So as I go through the presentation today, when I say housing insecure, I am talking about anyone who falls in this spectrum. So folks who are unsheltered, emergency sheltered, provisionally accommodated, and at risk of homelessness. So just wanted to kind of ground us there. But that kind of brings me to the 2023 Alberta Provincial Housing and Service Needs Estimation. So as Laurel kind of mentioned, in late 2022, RDN received Reaching Home funding to support the third iteration of the provincial estimation project. And the purpose of the project really was to provide, a comprehensive picture of housing insecurity in Alberta, both kind of in individual communities, but then also on a provincial scale. We also were aiming to support or help inform service providers and municipal provincial and federal policies, practices, and funding decisions on homelessness, on housing, and support services. And then maybe most importantly, we're really looking to elevate and incorporate the voices of folks who are actually experiencing homelessness in the solutions to end homelessness. So once funding had been confirmed, we put out a call for interest to rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across the province who might want to participate in the estimation. And as Lisa had mentioned a little bit earlier, we have done the provincial estimation twice before in Alberta, so in 2018 and then again in 2020. This year's iteration of the provincial estimation was super interesting because we saw many more regionalized applications to participate in the project than we ever have before. So in past estimations, we saw anywhere from like 2 to 5 communities that had partnered or regionalized to conduct their estimation. This time around, after receiving many expressions of interest, we partnered with 21 groups that represent roughly 45 rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across the province. And so really exciting to see the interest in the project, but also really highlighting the need for this work. So they're all on the screen here, and they're also listed in our provincial report. So, as is suggested in the step-by-step guide to estimating rural, remote, and Indigenous homelessness, we used a service-based population estimation approach to enumerating homelessness across the province. And I always laugh a little when I say that because it's a hilariously long name. But basically what it means is that we supported participating communities to recruit service agencies who would then administer surveys in their community over a 30-day period. So service agencies ranged from FCSS offices to food banks, libraries, outreach or day programs, provincial service agencies like Alberta Works, and in some cases, even restaurants. It was entirely dependent on, what kind of services are available in each participating community. So staff at service agencies were required to attend an orientation and training session in advance of the enumeration, which really focused on providing, that overview of the picture, but also highlighting the survey tool itself, and then going through some training around how do we ethically and comfortably administer surveys with community members. Once that training was complete, staff at participating agencies were instructed to invite anyone coming through their doors during the enumeration period to fill out a paper survey. They could do that independently or with the support from a staff member. And then the survey was also available in each participating community via an open SurveyMonkey link that was advertised usually on social media in each community. So the enumeration period itself was from March 1st to 31st in all but one community, whose enumeration period was March 10th to April 10th, and that was just due to some community circumstance happening. And then at the end of the 30 days, communities sent all of their completed surveys back to us at RDN for data entry, analysis, and report writing. So 2 key aspects of the survey that I just want to highlight before we dive into the results, because it really kind of changes our numbers here. So it'll explain a few things. 2 key things that we really admit the survey when we were administering the survey with community members that we really wanted to focus on are consent and then the unique ID or the identifier. So these aspects were discussed at length with staff during the orientation and training sessions, but I also want to touch on them again here. So in order for surveys to be analyzed, we required informed consent. And so what this means is that respondents must consent to the survey. So they actually had to press, or either if they were online, click yes, or if they were in person doing it on paper, check the yes box when asked if they consent to the survey. And so there was a bit of a description on what the survey was, why we're asking for their information, how we will use the info, and then talking about the consent process. And it was all written at a grade 6 reading level, and we encourage staff to walk through consent with with community members if they were supporting them in filling out the survey. If they clicked no, or if they skipped the consent question, then their survey was not included in the final analysis. Similarly, we required respondents to complete what we call a unique identifier, or a unique ID for short. And so the purpose of this unique ID is really to ensure privacy and confidentiality in survey responses, while also maintaining data integrity. So by collecting the unique ID, we are able to track or identify any duplicate surveys. So if someone's filled out the survey more than once, happens when, you know, there's so many different agencies promoting the survey, then we could actually identify if that person has filled out the survey more than once. And in that case, we would just use their most recent entry in the survey. But we can do that without actually asking for people's names or any significant identifying information. And so both supporting us in maintaining data integrity, but also still supporting the privacy and confidentiality of respondents. So if people had not filled out that unique ID, then we also had to exclude their survey from our analysis. And so with that in mind, at the end of the enumeration period, we received 4,877 surveys across the participating communities. 1,666 were excluded, mainly because they either lacked consent or they did not complete the unique ID. In some cases, responses were also excluded because they were outside of the participating communities. With all that said, you know, after kind of cleaning out the data and really narrowing things down, we ended up with 3,211 surveys that were deemed suitable for further analysis, and they are the basis of today's presentation and the report results. So the rest of the presentation will really focus on highlighting results and recommendations from the project. So to start us off, I wanted to kind of set the tone for what our big find was, I guess. So analysis on survey responses indicated that 2,429 respondents were experiencing housing insecurity according to national definitions of homelessness. What was really interesting is that only 1,263 of these respondents, so about half, self-identified as housing insecure when asked if they would consider their housing situation to be unstable in the survey. And so in the survey, we asked folks to self-identify, do you think your housing situation is unstable or that you could easily lose your housing? They would say yes, no, I'm not sure. But then on top of that, what we do is we do an analysis based on a series of questions, and we actually categorize folks as housing insecure or not based on that analysis, which is in line with the national definitions of homelessness. And so I find this really interesting because many of the respondents who suggested that their housing situation was stable, they noted owning or renting their home, but they also indicated that they don't have access to safe drinking water, or maybe they don't have electricity, things like that. And it's particularly interesting because it means that, respondents who are unaware that their housing situation is considered unstable, they're likely not accessing supports or services that would support them in securing more safe and adequate housing. So noticed a bit of a disconnect there. On top of the 2,429 housing insecure respondents, we also identified 2,354 dependents under 18 and 2,537 additional adults as sharing housing insecure conditions with these respondents. So what this kind of tells us is that based on survey results, there are at least 7,320 community members experiencing housing insecurity across participating communities. And the top 3 reported reasons for housing insecurity were due to low wages, an inability to afford rent or mortgage payments, and increasing rent costs. So really all three tied to that income piece. One thing we really wanted to highlight in the report and with you all today is the spectrum of homelessness, and specifically the fact that people cycle through that spectrum regularly. So on your screen is the list of the 4 categories under that definition of homelessness that we talked about at the beginning. You know, our umbrella term for housing insecurity fits all of these. So, you know, we know that people cycle in and out of this spectrum regularly. So, for example, someone might be emergency sheltered one night, they might be unsheltered the next because, you know, the shelter's full, and then maybe they're provisionally accommodated, so they're couch surfing for a week or two after that. So recognizing this, we asked respondents to describe their current housing situation over the past month through a series of statements, and we encouraged them to select all the statements that applied to them over the past month. And so because respondents could select more than one statement, you know, reflecting more than one experience or circumstance, to reflect that kind of cyclical nature, we've highlighted all of the experiences of housing insecurity shared by respondents at the time of the survey. So long-winded way to basically say that what this means is that there are actually more experiences of housing insecurity listed here than there are the number of people in the project that are experiencing housing insecurity. But we didn't want to be missing anyone's experiences, and so we really wanted to capture them all here. So the majority of housing insecure respondents were provisionally accommodated or at risk of homelessness at the time of the survey, though many were also unsheltered and emergency sheltered. And again, I think it's really important that we're sharing this table because it really does demonstrate the diversity of housing insecurity in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across the province. So respondents who experienced being at risk of homelessness emphasized difficulty in paying their rent or mortgage, and or, you know, staying in a house that needed major repairs. So maybe a house that didn't have windows, for example, or didn't have electricity. These respondents also noted living in overcrowded housing situations where there's not enough bedrooms for the amount of people, and or in homes that were provided or rented out by their employer or an Indigenous nation. And then respondents who experienced being provisionally accommodated indicated stays in jail, prison, or remand centers, medical and detox facilities, transitional housing units. And then many also indicated staying in homes where they experienced violence because they had nowhere else to go. Excuse me, staying with a stranger because they had nowhere else to go, and or enduring unwanted sexual activity for a place to stay. So for the sake of time, I feel like I could go on and on, but I am not going to go through all of the survey respondent demographics, but I did just want to highlight a few of these demographic information to paint a bit of a picture. So 59% of survey respondents identified as female compared to 36% as male. Additionally, 3% of respondents were either trans female, trans male, or gender nonconforming. 39% of respondents self-identified as Indigenous, so 61% of those as First Nations, 21% as Métis, 1% as Inuit, and then 7% as having other Indigenous ancestry. And then lastly, a stat that I really did want to highlight here, as you'll see, it becomes a bit of a theme throughout the results, is that 22% of respondents noted staying in foster care, a youth group home, or under a youth or young adult agreement in the past. Based on respondent demographics, and specifically housing insecure respondent demographics, we were able to, you know, identify several concerning trends. So I wanted to highlight those here and have a bit of a conversation around them. So first, we determined that 91% of Indigenous respondents are housing insecure. While this is not necessarily a surprise to folks, as Indigenous folks tend to experience homelessness at disproportionate rates compared to non-Indigenous people, it's still a concerning trend we wanted to highlight because it's clearly something that's still happening. We also determined that 97% of respondents who spent time in care are housing insecure. And maybe even more significant, 81% of housing insecure respondents who spent time in care are Indigenous. So really speaking to kind of the colonial structures of our care system and how that impacts folks as they move through the care system. So again, not necessarily a surprise to people, but still a really concerning trend. We also discovered that 97% of 2S LGBTQIA+ respondents are housing insecure. 88% of immigrant and refugee respondents are housing insecure, and 89% of veteran respondents are housing insecure. So what we're seeing are really, some pretty significant trends, some concerning trends, which really coming together seem to suggest that minority or vulnerable population groups are experiencing housing insecurity at staggering rates in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. One thing that I found was really interesting in our results were around rates of employment among housing secure and housing insecure respondents, in that they're almost the same. So 70% of housing secure respondents were employed in some capacity at the time of the survey, whereas 69% of housing insecure respondents were employed in some capacity at the time of the survey. And this similarity really continues as we break down what those types of employment are. So 73% of housing secure respondents are in full-time positions compared to 68% of employed housing insecure respondents. Again, 19% of employed housing secure respondents are in part-time positions compared to 21% of employed housing insecure respondents. And then 4% of employed housing secure respondents are in casual roles. Ooh, I almost switched that. Compared to 7% of employed housing secure respondents. So not really a significant difference in employment rates at all between groups. We also asked respondents in the survey to indicate their approximate household income for 2022. So 30% of housing insecure respondents noted an annual household income of $30,000 or less, while 19% noted an annual income of between $30,000 and $49,999. And I think it's helpful to take a minute here and really re-emphasize that 69% of housing insecure respondents are employed in some capacity. So one of the myths or misconceptions that I hear the most in my role is that people experiencing housing insecurity should just get a job. But what this data is showing us is that not only do a majority of housing insecure respondents already have a job, but clearly when we look at the disparity between the number of folks with a job versus the income they're receiving, I think what we're seeing is that sometimes having a job isn't actually enough. We wanted to understand, one of the things that we hear from communities a lot are, who are the people who are experiencing housing insecurity? Are the people who have lived here their whole lives? Did they just move to the community? What is their circumstance and how is that maybe contributing to housing insecurity? And so we asked respondents, how long have you been in the community? Were you born here? Have you been here for, a long term, so 10 plus years, et cetera. And so 19% of housing insecure respondents have always lived in their community, so they were born there, while many others kind of migrated later in life. So 12% have lived in their community for less than a year, while 42% have lived in their community for 3+ years. And those who were not born in their community were asked, why did they come to their community? And so the top 5 reasons folks relocated were to be closer to family, to start a job, to look for work, for the lifestyle that the community offers, and to find housing. So a variety of reasons as to why housing insecure respondents are relocated or relocating, or why they relocated to their community. Though I think it is interesting that 3 of the top 5 are related to income and housing. Another data point to highlight in respondents' living situation is the lack of amenities housing insecure respondents have access to. Now, I always like to clarify this because we use the term amenities, but I don't mean, added bonuses or nice things to have in a housing situation. Many of these amenities are actually deemed necessary in housing situations by the federal and provincial governments to be considered safe and adequate housing. So we asked respondents to identify which amenities they don't have in their current housing situation, and we gave them, a series of options. So 23% of housing insecure respondents do not have sufficient and affordable heating. 16% lack safe drinking water, and then 11% don't have electricity. So this is a lot of people in any case, but when we also think about the extreme kind of weather situations that we get in Alberta, this is particularly concerning. Not having heat or electricity can be incredibly unsafe and detrimental to someone's health and safety moving forward. Another one I want to point out is that 18% of housing insecure respondents don't have fire protection. So things like fire extinguishers, smoke detectors, and a safe exit path from their unit or structure in their current housing situation. And I think it's interesting to highlight this because many of our housing insecure respondents are renting, and fire protection is actually a mandatory requirement in rental units in Alberta. So maybe some concerns around what the rental states are looking like right now. Unfortunately, we also found that 5% of housing insecure respondents were experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence in their living situations at the time of the survey. 59% of these respondents identified as female, 35% as male, 2% as trans male, and 2% as gender nonconforming. 10% also identified as 2S LGBTQIA+, and 60% were Indigenous. So on top of being housing insecure as a result of experiencing violence, these respondents also reported low wages and an inability to afford rent and mortgage as reasons for housing insecurity. And 51% of them reported an annual household income of less than $30,000 in 2022. And this really speaks to some research, well, not some, to much research across the country that really suggests income as a contributing factor to successfully fleeing violence. And then continuing the theme of interactions with the care system, 40% of housing insecure respondents experiencing violence reported past stays in the care system. Excuse me, it's so much talking, I gotta keep drinking water. So a big component of the housing and service needs estimation, while we are looking to kind of enumerate or estimate the number of folks experiencing homelessness and understand their experiences, we're also trying to get a bit of a snapshot into service use and service gaps in each community, and then also provincially. And so we asked respondents a series of questions around their service use, service gaps that they've identified, and their ability to access services, or the ease of their ability to access these services. So the top 3 reasons housing insecure respondents access services are for basic needs, for health and wellness. So this could be anything from medical doctor to addiction support to mental health related supports, dentist, eye care. It's kind of all umbrella turned under health and wellness. And then support services. And so in speaking to service use and service gaps, I think one thing to highlight here is that lack of transportation was identified as a very significant barrier for housing insecure respondents, really across the board. So because community members in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities often have to travel outside of their community to access services, for example, to access medical services, or in some cases even for emergency shelter services. Lack of transportation really prohibits many housing insecure respondents from being able to access these things. 34% of respondents noted traveling by vehicle to access services outside their community, but 16% relied on family or friends. 15% had to take a taxi or had a service agency arrange transportation for them. 5% resorted to hitchhiking to access services. And then many more respondents noted simply not bothering to access services at all because of the lack of transportation options. And I think this is a big concern because, research suggests that access to services is critical, really, in stabilizing one's housing situations. And so without the ability to access necessary services, whether they be medical services, emergency shelter services, or otherwise, housing insecure respondents will likely continue to experience housing insecurity at much higher rates than folks who are able to access services. And so kind of a big flag there in terms of lack of transportation and its role in housing insecurity. Speaking to kind of supports and services, we also spoke to respondents about emergency shelter use, and specifically because there's a lack of available emergency shelters in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, and so we really wanted to understand their shelter use patterns. Of the 2,429 housing insecure respondents, 326 unique respondents, so 13% of housing insecure respondents, accessed emergency shelter within 12 months of responding to the survey. And our results suggest that many respondents access multiple types of shelter and on multiple occasions. And so the slide here in front of you kind of shows a little bit of a breakdown. The majority of folks are accessing a standard emergency shelter. That is what's most readily available across the province. Though many were also accessing women's or domestic violence shelters and emergency weather shelters, also known as MAP programs. And there was a decent amount of folks who didn't actually know what type of shelter they accessed, just that it kept them off the street for the night. On top of that, 5% of housing insecure respondents noted staying in transitional housing within 12 months of the survey. And maybe even more importantly, and again, speaking to the need for emergency shelter in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, is that 24% of housing insecure respondents did not access emergency shelter when they needed one. And the top 5 reported reasons for this were that the shelter was full, the right kind of shelter wasn't available, so maybe they needed a women's or domestic violence shelter and it wasn't there. There were no shelters in the area because of safety concerns, and then the lack of transportation, not being able to actually access an emergency shelter that's in a different community. And I want to repeat this because I think it's a really significant finding. 24% or 581 respondents did not access emergency shelter when they needed one, so when they had nowhere else to go or they were staying outside, because of identified barriers to usage. So another common question I get from people, or one of, I guess, maybe the most common questions I get from people is around whether or not the number of folks experiencing housing insecurity has increased over the years. And now that we've conducted 3 estimations or 3 iterations of the provincial estimation, we thought it'd be kind of interesting to compare some of the data across the years. I do want to preface this and say that, some of the communities who have, who are participating in this year's estimation have participated across all 3 estimations. But there are several new communities this year. So the comparison isn't exact because we're kind of comparing a rough picture of rural, remote, and Indigenous Alberta versus a direct comparison from community to community. But I do think it'll provide us with a kind of a loose or a rough kind of trend between 2018 and now. So from 2018 to 2020, RDN updated the analysis framework that we use to determine housing status, which does make it difficult to track rates of homelessness across the years. In 2018, housing insecure respondents were identified based on their self-identified status. So, if they said yes to the question, is your housing situation unstable, or do you feel like you could easily lose your housing? If they said yes, they were considered housing insecure. In 2020, we updated the analysis framework so that housing insecure respondents were actually identified through their responses to a series of questions and then analyzed against the national definitions of homelessness. And this is the same framework that we applied now in 2023. Excuse me. So because of this shift in frameworks, it is quite difficult to accurately determine whether rates of homelessness have increased or not in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across Alberta. That being said, what I can say is that research from across Canada suggests that there has been a significant increase in homelessness over the past 5 years. And, some research also even suggests that homelessness is occurring in rural areas at rates that are equivalent or greater to urban centers. Another data point that's really interesting to compare across the 3 iterations is the reported reasons for housing insecurity. So across all 3 iterations of the estimation, low wages was the #1 reported reason for housing insecurity. And then an inability to afford rent or mortgage was the second most reported reason for housing insecurity. When we get to the 3rd reason, though, that's when it varies across each year. So in 2018, it was reported as due to conflict. So that could be conflict with family, with a spouse or partner, or a landlord. In 2020, the 3rd reported reason was mental health concerns. And this time around, it's increasing rent costs. So 2023 is the first time that all 3 main reported reasons for housing insecurity are strictly focused on income. That's not to say that there are not other contributing factors, but the top 3 reasons are related to income. One of the most significant differences in trends between 2018 and now is specific to employment rates among housing insecure respondents. So in 2018, 31% of housing insecure respondents were employed in some capacity. In 2020, this actually decreased a little bit to 27%. And then as you can see now in 2023, employment rates have more than doubled to 69% of housing insecure respondents employed in some capacity. And this is really interesting. It's a really interesting trend to highlight, given that at the same time as employment rates have increased, the number of people experiencing housing insecurity has also increased. So I think that, high costs of living, low minimum wage rates, COVID-19, and then the current housing crisis are all likely contributing factors to why we're seeing increased rates of housing insecurity, despite also seeing increased rates of employment among housing insecure respondents. Okay, So now I want to take, I've thrown a lot of information at you, and we will be also providing you with a link to the report where you can dive into some of this a little bit more if you're a bit more of a visual learner like I am. But I do want to take a little bit of time to discuss the kind of now what. So, based on the results that we presented today and that are outlined in the report in more detail, we've identified a series of opportunities to address housing insecurity in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across the province. Really that now what? We have the information, what do we do about it? Each community received their own report highlighting their community's survey results, and then also a series of opportunities that they can undertake at a local level that are specific to their results. And then bigger picture, we believe that there is a larger role for municipal, provincial, and federal governments, as well as funders and industry partners to play in addressing rural, remote, and Indigenous housing insecurity moving forward. And so that's kind of what I want to go over here is some of the opportunities that were identified through the provincial report and through that kind of larger provincial picture of data. So there's a lot here. I'm going to touch on I'm going to kind of touch on a few points and highlight some of the points, and then we can have a conversation after the fact if people are interested in terms of diving into things in more depth. But the first opportunity is really focused on increasing awareness and understanding of housing insecurity in communities and then across the province. So one of the main reasons for this is because of the number of housing insecure respondents who believed that their current housing situation was stable. So that piece that I talked about at the beginning, 48% of housing insecure respondents, so that's 1,166 people, believed that their housing situation was secure or stable at the time of the survey, even though, according to national definitions of homelessness, they are considered housing insecure. Results also revealed that 23% of housing insecure respondents did not have sufficient and affordable heating, and 16% did not have access to safe drinking water. And then something I didn't touch on in the presentation, but that came up quite a bit in our qualitative results, were incidences of racism, discrimination, and judgment towards housing insecure respondents. So knowing all that, we really identified a need for kind of promoting increased understanding and awareness of housing insecurity in communities and then provincially. So at the community level, RDN recommended hosting community conversations aimed at decreasing instances of racism and discrimination and then increasing understanding of housing insecurity, both with the hopes that we would see kind of more empathy from folks and their neighbors, better conversations between neighbors, but then also that folks who are experiencing housing insecurity might actually begin to access services that could support them in stabilizing their housing situation. More broadly, RDN is calling for mandatory orientation and training sessions for government elected officials around key issues of housing insecurity to better serve their constituents. And then we're also we're calling for leadership from all levels of government to promote a better understanding of housing insecurity across the province, to support the recognition that housing is a human right, and then really to address the staggering number of rural, remote, and Indigenous Albertans without access to heat and water, and to address the disproportionate number of Indigenous Albertans experiencing housing insecurity. Results also kind of suggested an overwhelming need for accessible and affordable public transportation options in Alberta. Transportation was identified as a major barrier to accessing services, including emergency shelter services, and then was identified as the biggest need in most communities participating in the estimation. So individual communities have been encouraged to conduct an accessibility audit of public infrastructure and develop formal or informal public transportation options in their communities. We recognize, though, that this is not an easy task. And so given this, RDN is calling on all levels of government to lead the development and implementation of a longer-term rural transportation system. The third opportunity is really around conducting a gap analysis and an audit of service offerings across rural and remote Alberta. So a majority of respondents indicated the need for increased or improved services in their individual communities. So for example, we touched on this, 24% of housing insecure respondents indicated that they did not access emergency shelter when they needed it for a variety of reasons, including that the shelter was full, the right kind of shelter wasn't available, and or there were no shelters in their area. Individual communities were encouraged to audit and map the availability of services in their area with the intention of increasing the types of services available to residents, and or, if there actually are these services in the community, then promoting the awareness of these services to individual community members. More broadly, RDN is calling on all levels of government to support rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in conducting their audits to identify and address service gaps. Additionally, we're calling on service providers, funders, and all levels of government to explore opportunities in developing a model for more regionalized approaches to service delivery in rural and remote Alberta. And relating to that, we are calling on all levels of government to invest additional dollars to support capacity building and the foundational steps in the implementation of coordinated access in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in Alberta. And then in terms of addressing the housing crisis, we recommend conducting an audit of current housing options in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities across Alberta. So a major theme that came across each of the communities in the estimation was the lack of emergency shelter services, and then also the lack of affordable and accessible housing options. Also clear through the results, less so spoken about today, but in the report, are the number of housing insecure respondents with more complex needs. So 17% of housing insecure respondents reported addictions or substance use, illness or medical condition, mental health issues, mental disability, and or physical disability as a contributing factor to their housing instability, or their housing insecurity, I should say. So to address this, individual communities with a lack of emergency shelter and or accessible and affordable housing have been encouraged to advocate for and develop more housing options in their area. Bigger picture, RDN is calling on the provincial government to conduct an audit of emergency shelters in rural and remote Alberta, focusing on current gaps in shelter services with the intention of ultimately supporting a more inclusive, accessible, and robust emergency shelter system across the province that, expands kind of beyond providing winter shelter beds and includes mandatory wraparound services to support folks with more complex needs. And then we're also calling on all levels of government, local and provincial service providers and funders to collaborate to develop a consistent model of the housing first philosophy to again support respondents with more complex needs. And recognizing the need for more affordable and accessible housing options across the province, RDN recommends that all levels of government collaborate with local service providers and housing developers to facilitate a review of current land zoning and bylaw regulations to support the development of more creative and diverse housing options. Additionally, we're calling on all levels of government to increase funding for rural and remote, accessible and affordable housing projects, and specifically kind of that pre-development or seed funding and sustainable operational funding. So with at least 7,320 community members, so that big picture when we add up the folks experiencing housing insecurity who responded to the survey, sorry, the dog's going in the background, as well as their dependents and additional adults living with them, with that kind of large group of folks experiencing housing insecurity across participating rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in Alberta. I think it's really critical that service providers, all levels of government, industry, and funders work together to address housing insecurity moving forward. I spent a lot of time reflecting on this throughout the entire project, but I think it's really important for all of us to kind of take a moment and reflect on this, which is, adequate housing is often viewed as really a social issue, but it's so much more than that. Housing is a human right, and it impacts not only social policy but health systems and economic development, locally, regionally, provincially, even federally. So I can't even emphasize the importance of kind of recognizing housing as we move forward. So as I kind of reflect on that, but also on the findings and recommendations that we highlighted today, I wanted to flag maybe 3 takeaways that I kind of took from this. First, given the number of service gaps identified in individual communities across the province, collaboration and a regionalized approach to addressing housing insecurity will be important moving forward. Second, research and data collection on rural, remote, and Indigenous housing insecurity is essential to continuing to identify, to monitor, and to address relevant housing issues and trends moving forward at a local, a regional, and a provincial scale. And then lastly, to successfully address housing insecurity in rural, remote, and Indigenous communities in Alberta, an increase in provincial and federal funding to support communities located outside the 7 major cities is required. So that was a lot of information thrown at you at once. I do encourage you all to review the report, which I believe is linked in the chat and will be sent out to you all afterwards. For more details on anything to discuss today, if you're someone who needs to kind of sit with this information, you're welcome to reach out to us at a later date to kind of have a conversation or ask any questions.